Well, hi, this is Mike Hingson, and once again, welcome to an episode of Unstoppable Mindset. Today, we get to interview someone that I got a chance to know fairly recently, Carynn Rudolph, and she is a disabled military and Marine Corps specifically veteran. She's got a lot of different kinds of experiences, and now she's, among other things, working to help a home for youth in Colorado. We're going to get to all that. I don't want to give much away, and that's what makes it tough to describe, because if I start talking more, she won't have anything to say, and we don't want that. So, Caryn, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, a pleasure, and we're really glad you're here, and I hope people will enjoy what you have to say, and I'm sure they will, and we'll kind of make it as fun as we can make it. And as always, it's always fun to ask people to talk a little bit at first about what it was like growing up. What was Caryn, the younger person, like, and tell us about your growing up experiences and all that.
Sure. My name's Carynn Rudolph. I am originally from Savannah, Georgia. I grew up in Colorado, Aurora, Colorado. My dad was in the Army. That's what kind of brought us to Colorado. Traveled back and forth as a kid between Colorado and Georgia. Every summer we spent our summers in Georgia and with my grandparents. I have a twin brother and a little sister. I lived, the normal young person life, I suppose, and went off, joined the military, kind of following in my grandfather's footsteps. When I turned 18, I was going to join the Army and went off to the Marine Corps instead. They convinced me because I was able to do a couple of pull-ups. They told me that I was hardcore, and that was what sold me on the Marine Corps versus the Army.
So they don't do pull-ups in the Army? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know. That was all that it took 17-year-old to convince 17-year-old Caryn to go to the Marine Corps instead of the Army, though. So,
well, good for you. How long were you in the Marine Corps?
I did 4 years on active duty and got out in 2012. Wow.
And what did you do after that?
I did a number of different things. So I had a daughter shortly after I got out of the military, got married and all that stuff, went to school. I pastored for about 9 years after I got out of the military. And I started a nonprofit organization in 2016 called the Urban Youth Initiative that was focused on helping urban youth pastors specifically, like by equipping them with the skills and the ability to be able to support a young person who expressed that they were experiencing like suicidal ideation. And then I became a correctional officer. I did that for about 4 years. And now I work as a program manager at a youth homeless shelter.
I have some friends who retired from being in the federal correction officer business. She was a pastor, but they both had been involved in doing correctional officer kinds of things. We knew them in New Jersey. They've retired now to Florida, but it was really fascinating to talk with them, and certainly not a position I envy a whole lot.
Yeah, I always tell people think I'm like crazy when I say this, but that was one of the best jobs I ever had.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with youth specifically in like a secured facility, but it was a lot of fun. You get to build really cool relationships with the young people and help them not like make the same mistakes that got them landed there, hopefully anyway, but just by having those relationships and running groups and things like that. So yeah,
well, hopefully you were pretty successful at it and people didn't go back to what they were doing before.
I hope so. I definitely hope so. I haven't run into anybody that I worked closely with yet, but yeah.
Did you do that in Colorado?
I did. After I got out of the military, I came back to Colorado, and that's where I met my ex-husband, and we had a couple kids and all that sort of stuff. So
that was Tara.
So Tara is my wife now. There's a whole story behind all that, but yeah, Tara is my wife. I met her during COVID, after I had gotten my divorce from my ex-husband and
Ah.
like all that, after leaving the church.
So what got you into pastoring after leaving the Marine Corps? What made you decide to go that route as opposed to going to school or any number of other things that you could have done?
It's a great question. I did go to school. I was like kind of bivocational. I went to school and pastored at the same.
Okay.
But I took that route because when I was on active duty, I I went through a sexual assault incident when I was on active duty, and you know, I started going to church after that, and that was something that really helped me as I like navigated that like trauma experience and all that. And yeah, so I started getting involved in church more and stuff like that. And I was like, I think this is something I really want to do, and started working in ministry after that.
Did the powers that be, if you will, handle the sexual assault at all reasonably well, or was it just like a lot of things that we hear kind of covered up? Or
it was one of those kinds of cover up.
yeah,
and I was, it wasn't. They didn't handle it that well, and I think that since my discharge, since I got out of the military, they have really done a lot to recognize that like military sexual trauma is something that a lot of female veterans specifically experience. Not just female veterans, but female veterans, a lot of them tend to experience that. And so I think that the ratio is like 1 in 5, or the statistic is like 1 in 5 women who serve will experience some form of military sexual trauma in their time in service.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate that there is so much of that goes on. Guys think that they're so tough, and the reality is it's, I think, more a sign of weakness, but nevertheless, they think they can take things out on people, and that's too bad.
Indeed.
Well, so did you get a college degree then when you got out and were doing that while pastoring?
Yes. Yeah. It took some time. I pursued higher education seeking like for psychology with an emphasis on substance use and addiction. And that was kind of what drove my passion to like work with youth, like learning about psychology and, wanting to be able to help support people who are experiencing different degrees of a mental health crisis. So,
well, but why youth as opposed to working with older people? Do you think that did you feel you could have a greater influence if you were working with younger people, or just kind of was your sort of style?
I think that it's a little bit of both. I think that part of it is I want to be able to make a difference before folks get kind of stuck in their ways as young adults, as adults. And I like to think that I'm a pretty cool person. So that's why I've stuck around working with young people for as long as I have.
My wife was a teacher, and she always said that she loved the younger grades, like third grade, because by the time kids were in the 5th and 6th grade, they were starting to get more set in ways and they were harder to really have as much of an influence on. So I can imagine that the older kids got when you got them in those teenagers, or then if you saw people later on in life, you have exactly what you said. They're very set in their ways and they're not going to be very willing to change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so did you pastor for a church? How did all that work out, or how did you get started in that?
Yeah, I pastored. I started working in a church. We had a Bible college at the church that when I moved back to Colorado, I joined this ministry called the Rock Church of Denver, and they had a Bible college. So I started attending the Bible college while I was there, and went through their ordination program. It was a 3-year program. I got ordained and was serving as a youth pastor, served as a youth minister. I got licensed through them after about a year. And then the next 2 years just worked as a youth minister, and then got ordained as a pastor, served as their youth pastor, and then did some associate pastor duties as well. So did like youth ministry and worked with their like evangelism department and their media and sound department and things like that.
It sounds like from what you said a little while ago that you kind of were drawn more to God after the whole sexual assault incident.
Yes, that's correct.
And there's a lot of value in doing that. And of course, you know, God is a part of all of our lives in so many ways. So you have a relationship that still goes today, I trust.
Yes, yeah.
But what got you to get out of being a pastor after 9 years?
Well, I went through kind of a deconstruction journey, deconstruction / like a reconstruction journey, if you will, where I really started to evaluate certain like parts of the Bible that I couldn't reconcile. One of those verses was from Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29, that said that if a man finds a virgin and he rapes her, he can marry her. And I just couldn't reconcile that. And so it took some time. And, you know, I was like, I also was going through my divorce, took some time, backed away, and, you know, really kind of reevaluated my own personal values and where the scripture stood with me and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, that is as I went through that deconstruction process, I realized that I was in a place where I was really learning a lot more. And I didn't feel like I had the capacity to lead people as effectively as I would have wanted to, or believe was necessary for, you know, a person in a ministry position. So I stepped away.
Well, I hear what you're saying. What's really a challenge, of course, is that the Old Testament is in so many ways so different than the New Testament. And Jesus brings a whole different point of view or standpoint to a lot of it. But I hear what you're saying with justification, logical or not, of so if you rape a woman and a virgin, you can marry her, you know, well.
Yeah, I mean, that was just one piece of it. You know, I think that, you know, Paul's admonishment to the church and, you know, slaves, obey your master, and like think about how like the Bible was weaponized against marginalized folks.
Yeah.
I just it didn't sit right with me. And so I still believe in God. I still have a relationship with God. And I think that through some work and some time, I've been able to maintain that relationship and that honor for who the person of Jesus, just, you know, with a different respect and value for the Bible.
Yeah. Well, and the Bible was written by people. And so there are a lot of challenges, and, you know, it's no different for the Bible than the Caryn or anything else. There are a lot of paradoxes, and it's unfortunate. And sometimes people greatly misuse them as well.
Absolutely. I agree.
Which is never any fun. But anyway, so you got a degree and you were in the ministry for a while and all that. One of the things that I know you talk a lot about is this whole concept of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, JEDI.
Yeah.
You don't know the power of the light side of the force. I'm not going to go with Vader. But anyway, tell me more about JEDI and what got you into doing, talking about that or being involved with that.
Absolutely. I think there were a number of different things that really got me into that work. when I was on active duty in the military, I experienced some racism and things like that. And as a result of the things that I experienced while on active duty, I wanted to find ways to ensure that I could support people who had experienced the same things that I did. That's part of the reason why I pursued a degree in psychology, right? And I just got really hungry to learn more and more about like the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion kind of principles. And that tied into some of the other work that I do. I'm also a firearms instructor, and I own a business as a gun instructor. And I learned a lot about like how even certain parts of our Constitution were weaponized against Black folks and Indigenous folks, and how that translates to today. The work that I do now, I'll go back even to the work that I was doing in corrections, looking at how Black and brown people are disproportionately represented in the justice system. Was something that, I wanted to learn more about and, find ways that we can reconcile like the justice system to make it more equitable. The child welfare system. I work with young people. I sit on a board for the state of Colorado child welfare, equity, diversity, inclusion to evaluate the child welfare system in the state of Colorado. And then the work that I do for the homeless shelter where I work, I look at the, how Black and brown youth specifically, because I work with young people, are overrepresented in our programs, and like evaluating how we can better support and serve those folks. Does that kind of answer your question?
So, yeah. And so you continue to do that. Have you ever thought of also, if you're going to talk about the system and so on, studying the law and doing anything in the law world?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I study the law quite a bit. Especially in the work that I do, both at Together, which is the homelessness organization that I work for, but then also for Goliath Tactical Firearms Training, which is my business. There's so much that we do there. I would say, like, for the firearms industry specifically, I look at how red flag laws or how magazine capacity limits have disproportionately affected Black folks. And anytime there are opportunities to testify, I try to seek out the opportunity to do just that. This past Wednesday, as a matter of fact, Colorado had an assault weapons ban bill that they were, we had an opportunity to testify. I was able to give a testimony and present how the gun laws that they have proposed would have disproportionately affected Black and brown folks, or prevented folks who are disabled from being able to gain access to the tools that they need to be able to protect and defend themselves and things like that. So it was a really good opportunity.
Well, tell me more about that when you're talking about assault weapons and so on. So are you not in favor of banning assault weapons in any way, or what kind of is your stance on that?
Yeah, so I am not in favor, no. And the reason for that is because, first and foremost, I when I presented this on Wednesday, one of the things that I brought up was that that kind of legislation would create increased surveillance in lower income and BIPOC communities, first and foremost. There's statistics from like the Harvard Law Review that have demonstrated that when people when there were laws passed about like magazine capacity limits, for example, it created increased surveillance in Black communities and gave law enforcement officers free rein to be able to go and question Black folks more. And then like Black folks were arrested more. And it, I'm a gun person, so I know that we aren't the only ones who are carrying around high capacity magazines, right? So I think that it would create increased surveillance in BIPOC communities, number one. And then I believe that everyone should have equal and fair access to the tools that they need to be able to protect and defend themselves however they see fit, because being able to protect yourself is a fundamental human right.
Mm-hmm.
Pistols can be really hard for folks who have arthritis or like carpal tunnel and other I apologize, the word escapes me right now, but like folks who have a hard time being able to like rack slides back or manage recoil and things like that. Mm-hmm. And what people are calling an assault rifle would be better is really an Armalite rifle. Those would be easier for a person to manage who's like in a wheelchair, for example. They would be able to better manage that recoil because it's absorbed, like the shock is being absorbed in their bodies and things like that. So, yeah.
But what's the solution? I hear people saying, well, we got to really deal with the people who have mental illness. Well, it's not just about that. Yeah. And I think that the other part of the discussion has to be not just why we shouldn't ban assault weapons, and I think that's a topic to discuss, but more important, what's the real solution to address the issues? Because it seems like really the genie has come out of the lamp, or the cat's come out of the bag, and it's very difficult to get any control over any of this. And we're seeing an increasing number of people, and yes, a lot of them are certainly minorities, but a lot of people who are being shot and killed because, to a large degree, of the so-called assault weapons and some of the higher end weapons that people deal with. What's our solution to that?
Well, I think so. That's a lot to unpack in that question.
Yeah, I know it is a complex issue. I know
it's a complex issue for sure. I would say first and foremost, we should look at the poverty rates in America. First and foremost, we need to address the root cause, because addressing a tool is not going to get rid of the problem, especially in a country like America, where we have so much access to illegal guns, illegal weapons that are being used to commit crimes on a regular basis. So I think that being able to address root causes, poverty, folks not having equal and fair access to healthcare or behavioral health services. I think that in order to address poverty, right? Like I actually posted a TikTok video about this today, and someone had asked that exact question. They compared America to Switzerland and said, well, Switzerland has like gun registrations, blah, blah. America, the median income for an American citizen is around $31,000 a year. In a place like Switzerland or other developed nations, it's anywhere from like $7,000 up. Okay. People are going to do what they feel is necessary to be able to provide for their families and for themselves. People need equal access to food. People need access to medicine, to healthcare. They need access to behavioral health services. If we can find ways to increase funding, and I have ideas about ways that we could do that. We were to find ways to increase funding and access for folks to be able to get healthcare first and foremost. Okay, universal healthcare. I'm one of those weird people that believes that we should have universal healthcare. Okay. I'm not saying it's a weird thing. I'm saying like I believe we need to have universal healthcare. I think that there needs to be more funding or access to behavioral health or social service programs in America. You know, I work for the youth homelessness organization, like I mentioned, and we have to like beg. I went to DC in March and was asking for the government to fund the Runaway Homeless Youth Services Act, so that we can continue to provide services. And they were like, I don't know, our legislators were. And so, providing funding for programs like that to address the root causes that contribute to gun violence would be great. I've heard folks say things like, well, single parent homes also have like higher rates of gun violence and things like that. I don't have the data. I'm not looked into that. Yeah. I come from a single parent home, but being able to address the mental health care or the mental health problems that folks might deal with as a result of coming from a single parent home, to me would suffice. So yeah, addressing those big items would be how I would attack the beast called gun violence.
I guess my thought would be that some of that may help, but I still haven't really seen the connection that even if we provided a higher mean income for people, and even if we provide healthcare and so on, there are some other issues like the whole racial issue. So many times Black people are shot by white people, and it's oftentimes white people who have, at least apparently, a better income. And now we've seen in fairly recent times some people who have shot other people who got in the wrong car, or a basketball that went into somebody else's yard. And so the bottom line is that it has become so indiscriminate that it seems to me there has still got to be more to it, and there has to be some issue or some way to address the gun wielders a little bit in the process, because it can't all be put at the feet of a lack of income and other things. And I agree that there is a good amount of that, but I think there is more to it than that. And it has become so easy, and our judicial system has not addressed some of the issues with some of the people who have shot other people, and they haven't done it very well, it would seem to me, at least.
I agree with that. We saw the young man just this last week who was shot in the head by a person. He went to knock on this man's door. He thought his younger siblings were there, and he was shot in the head. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, he hasn't passed away.
No, he's surviving.
He's surviving, which is very fortunate. I would say that I would encourage. I'm the type of instructor. I offer a ton of free classes. I would encourage other instructors to offer those kinds of services as well. Doesn't have to be like all your class don't have to be free, but you could create like a tiered system to ensure that we're producing well-trained and responsible gun owners in America. Maybe it's something where we create some sort of a legislation that folks need to complete some sort of a training. But again, if we create legislation that says like you've got to complete this training, I think that it needs to be accessible even for lower income folks, if that's something that they're interested in. We don't want to create. Yeah, we should create barriers.
Absolutely. If you're going to do something, it has to be available and relevant to all. No question about that.
For sure. And maybe there are government offices or like police officers who offer free classes, and it doesn't have to fall on instructors like myself who offer to offer those free classes. Again, I offer a ton of free classes. I teach at least one free concealed carry class a month. I have a free developing a defensive mindset workshop that I offer, all sorts of different things. Everybody doesn't have to be like me, but it should be accessible.
Yeah. And I think there's no question that makes a lot of sense and that it needs to be. But I think that somehow it's very difficult to legislate responsibility in people. And I still kind of think that we're going to have to look at some other options to deal with some of the indiscriminate shootings and in general misbehaviors of people. In this country, we think that basically we have the freedom to do whatever we want, and too many people deal with that and go ahead and do it, and that creates challenges too.
Absolutely. I'm of the fold, just coming from corrections. I do believe that if a person wants to commit a crime, they're going to do it regardless. And I mean, coming from the jail, like I saw so many young people who would seek out opportunities just to victimize other people.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think we should just do away with guns at all.
And I would not suggest that either. I'm not convinced yet that high capacity firearms add value to our ability to protect. And I heard what you said about maybe people in wheelchairs can't handle particular kinds of guns and so on. But I think we need to look at ways of making firearms available. But I think that we also do need to look at the realities of how many things are being done by high-end, not high caliber, but high-end, high capacity, rapid fire weapons that aren't really adding value in society to do it.
So they aren't rapid fire.
Well, some are.
Well, no, they will, unless somebody does some sort of has a modification of some sort. They fire one round at a time. And I do want to just clarify. I didn't. If I misspoke and said that I think that folks in wheelchairs can't handle a handgun.
No, I wasn't saying that you were saying that. But I appreciate what you were saying.
Okay. Yeah. I want to make it as accessible as possible. I think that however folks see fit, maybe it's a baton, maybe it's just pepper spray, maybe it's a crossbow, however a person determines that they believe they need to protect themselves, I think we should all have equal and fair access to whatever tools we determine
sure
necessary for ourselves. We need that autonomy.
What prompted you initially? Your organization is what? Goliath Tactical Firearms Training?
Yes, that is correct.
And what prompted you to start it? I mean, I appreciate your beliefs and so on, but did something specific happen that caused you to want to have this organization and really teach people?
So I, like I mentioned, I was sexually assaulted when I was on active duty.
Mm-hmm.
I have been in a relationship that was not necessarily abusive, but they put their hands on me when I was younger. I was still in the military when this happened as well. After I got out of the military, I was exposed to a number of different things. Like I've witnessed people have their purses snatched. I have had someone try and carjack me. I had a situation when I was pregnant with my youngest daughter where I was pulling into my parking spot at home, and a guy comes downstairs and starts banging on my car hood, and he's banging on my window. I had to call my ex-husband, and he came to the window and helped me out, and to get the guy to go away. But all those sorts of instances that I experienced, I knew that I wasn't the only person in the world, and definitely not the only woman who had experienced that kind of those kinds of situations. I've experienced a lot of different things. And so being able to equip other women and men, individuals, with the tools to be able to protect and defend themselves has been something, it was just something that I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure other people felt like they could adequately defend themselves if they were ever faced with the same kinds of things that I was. And so I teach firearms safety. I also teach hand-to-hand combat, so self-defense that way. And I also teach first aid. So
do you operate a training school, or do you also sell firearms, or are you primarily in training?
I'm in training only. I don't want to sell firearms. I thought about it at one point, but I don't want to get into any of that sort of stuff. I just want to do the training stuff. That's all I've got the capacity for right now.
Well, in my opinion, that's the most important thing that really needs to be done. And I really wish more people would take advantage of truly learning what it's all about. We oftentimes think we know things that we don't know, or we don't know what we don't know. Mm-hmm. And that can be a real challenge too. So how long have you been training?
So I have been, Goliath Tactical Firearm Training has been in business since late 2019. I used to teach with my ex-husband as well, under Bravo Ops concealment. So I used to do that, and then I wanted to do it on my own, and started that in 2019 after we split. So
keeps you busy.
It does. It's something that I enjoy quite a bit. And he sells firearms, so I send all my people who want to buy guns to him, and then he sends the people who want to take classes to me. So we've got a pretty good partnership still.
Well, as a Marine Corps veteran and, certainly an MST survivor and so on, how do you use your JEDI training, if you will? And again, for those who may not have picked up on it, JEDI is, why don't you define it again?
It is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Right. Just to make sure we say that right. So how do you use your experiences to really inform people and help empower them?
I share a lot of stories, not necessarily about like the MST stuff in my classes, but I share a lot of stories with folks. And I provide free classes to women who have experienced like domestic violence or sexual assault, like free self-defense courses to those to folks who have experienced that. I try to provide as much education as possible about how gun control legislation has been historically used or weaponized against Black folks, Indigenous folks, and other people of color. I provide a lot of training on like how folks can get involved in advocacy work in their communities and things like that. So those are the big ways that I do that. And I have some more information on my website about like ways that we do that in depth. I offer a course called the Fair Fire Workshop as well, that really integrates JEDI principles into the firearms training that we do.
How so? Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, so we talk about ways that, again, like concealed carry law has been used to disproportionately affect Black and brown folks, and how folks can get involved in advocacy work in their communities, and how we can create collaborative solutions to get like that goal of ending gun violence together on both sides of the aisle. So the goal is to have folks who are not super familiar with firearms and stuff like that to come out and take that course as well.
If I were to make an observation about the whole issue of gun violence, gun control, and everything else, I think my chief observation would be it's been way too politicized. Yeah, I agree. And so we're not dealing with any of the real issues. Mm-hmm. And it has just become so politicized on all sides that it makes it really difficult to have a discussion. It's sort of the nature of what seems to be going on in the world, or at least in the US and probably elsewhere as well. But we're getting away from being able to have conversations and learning, which is too bad. It really is too bad. And I think that I wish that
more folks would be open to listen and learn. And that's really one of the goals of that workshop, is to get folks from all backgrounds, to get them to the table so that we can all participate in and contribute to this conversation about ending this epidemic of gun violence. But then also to provide education and resources so that people can protect and defend themselves.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more, if you would, about the Urban Youth Initiative that you're working on, and mental health relating to that and so on, because mental health is, of course, a buzzword that we hear a lot. But at the same time, there is a need for really addressing issues of mental health. But tell me more about the Urban Youth Initiative. Let's go from there.
Absolutely. That started in 2016. So it was shortly after I had my youngest daughter. I was still working in ministry, and I saw several youth. I don't want to say a lot of youth, but I had several young people who were involved in my ministry come to me, who had been experiencing mental health crises, young people who ran away from home, young people who had reported to me that they, maybe had experienced abuse and things like that. And what I found was that there was not a lot of training from my Bible college around the pastoral care piece that went into supporting people who were experiencing mental health crisis. And so I built a course in a small workbook called Suicide Prevention for the Urban Youth Worker, and shared that with a ton of youth pastors across the nation, and provided training and information and resources to help people who maybe weren't super familiar with, or didn't have the tools in their tool belt to handle crisis de-escalation in that capacity. I helped them navigate that. Pastors from all over America utilized that workbook. I shared it with quite a few folks. In 2020 during COVID, that disbanded just because it wasn't sustainable anymore. But the workbook is still available, and I still share that resource in some of the youth pastor and church communications groups that I'm a part of on social media and stuff.
So is that workbook something that's on your website that people can access?
Yes, it's still on the Urban Youth Ministry website, I believe. I've got to double check on that.
So clearly JEDI and firearms training to a lot of people would probably seem like two diametrically opposed concepts. How do you explain that to most people? I think we've talked about that some, but just to sort of sum it up, or maybe delve into it a little bit more.
Absolutely. So what a lot of folks don't there's not a lot of education around the history the history of gun control legislation, the history of the Second Amendment, and a lot of DEI work, at least the work that I've been involved in, has been learning about the history behind these laws, how they came to be, and then strategically creating ways to eliminate the barriers that folks might experience while trying to gain access to certain resources. And so I think that those two intersect because a lot of folks don't know the history behind the history behind the Second Amendment and gun control legislation. And so being able to provide that history, but then also share information about how that affects folks today, and then creating strategic solutions to be able to resolve those issues is how those two kind of intersect, those two things marry.
Something I'm just thinking about is that if you look at the Second Amendment, it basically says that people need to have the right to bear arms to sustain a militia and protect themselves. But then you also got people who would say, but do we really need the kinds of, today at least, guns that tend to be more and more appearing in our world in order to fulfill the provisions of and the commitment of the Second Amendment? Or is there some limit to all that? How do you answer that?
A great question. So there's a gentleman, his name is Tom Givens, and he did just a ton of like research and stuff like that. If I'm not mistaken, he worked for the FBI. Please don't quote me on that. But Tom Givens did a ton of research and things like that. His data is available. You can find books and things like that that helped to identify. Like he studied guns, like use of force incidents, gun laws, and things like that. Mm-hmm. One of the things that he found was that on average, it takes 4.5 shots to successfully stop a threat. And so having access to a semi-automatic firearm, or sometimes that's more than 4.5 shots, sometimes it's a little bit less. Having access to a firearm that has the capacity to carry more than 4 rounds is really important. But then also having access to a firearm that is easier to manage than like a revolver. Like I have some mild dexterity issues from the military with my right hand, which would be my dominant hand when shooting. And it makes it really challenging for me to be able to handle a revolver. I don't like shooting revolvers. They're really hard for me to grip with my hand and things like that. Some folks like them, but revolvers are not super easy for me to shoot. And those, if we were to get rid of like all semi-automatic weapons altogether, we would get rid of everything but a revolver, basically. And so it would be really challenging, I'd say, for some folks who do have dexterity issues like myself, to be able to use the tools that they need to be able to successfully eliminate a threat. Yeah, I apologize. I don't know where I was going with that. But
well, yeah. But again, are there limits? Again, it's still the issue of how do you reconcile the whole issue of what the Second Amendment says it was for, at least as I'm assuming that I'm reading it reasonably correctly, with the proliferation of more and more high capacity and other kinds of enhancements to guns, without having any kind of limit at all on what we make available to people. It just seems like we know that a lot of people don't tend to be very responsible. So is there some limit? Is there some process or governor that we can provide on all of that?
That's a very subjective statement to say that not everyone is super responsible, but I would say that high capacity magazines, folks should have access to whatever capacity magazine they determine to be necessary, just because there could be multiple threats or whatever the case is. Maybe it takes more than 5 shots. That's what I was getting at, sometimes it takes more than 5 shots to eliminate a threat or to have a threat stop. And so I think that taking into consideration the question you asked about like the history of it and, looking at like all the well-regulated militia, et cetera. I think that we also have to consider that historically speaking, Black folks were not allowed to possess guns because we were told that we weren't citizens, right? And so the language in that can be really elusive. But yeah, at any rate, I think that, high capacity folks should have access to whatever capacity they determine to be necessary.
It can be elusive. And I do appreciate that. But again, what we're also seeing are a lot of times where people are being shot where there isn't a threat. And how do we deal with that? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Can you give me an example?
Well, okay. I mean, the ones that we talked about, the father and daughter who were shot just because they went to get a basketball, or the young man, the 16-year-old who went to a house who just looking for relatives, and it happened to be the wrong house, but without any questions, the person in the house opened fire, or any number of other examples where, or any of the school shootings where people have gone into schools and they've opened fire, and there've been a significant number of those, but there wasn't a threat in any way. Or the guy who, 2 weeks ago in Memphis, went into a bank conference room because apparently he heard he was going to be fired, and so he killed a number of people and so on.
So all those instances that you mentioned, was specifically thinking about the ones of where, like school shootings, and the gentleman in Memphis who went into his job and shot the place up. Places like that. Those places are those folks targeted those places because they knew that those people would be unarmed. Now,
point exactly. How do we deal with a lot of that, though? Because it's an increasing number, and that's the issue. Is that the bottom line is there was no threat there,
right?
And so, how do you reconcile that kind of thing with the whole issue of a discussion of Second Amendment rights, just for anyone to be able to have any gun and so on?
I think that it's twofold, because to address the school shootings and the general, people going into targeting their workplaces and things like that is one thing. But then the issue of people who were scared gun owners just taking fire on people, like the 86-year-old guy who shot the kid, the 16-year-old kid last week. That's a separate, to me, that one, you deal with that a different way, right? By providing education and then tearing down stigma, addressing racism, addressing unconscious biases that folks might have, and things like that. Providing education is how you would deal with that issue on that side, with folks who are just walking around scared with firearms. On the side of where people are targeting people because they know that they are unarmed, school shootings specifically, we'll start there. I think that I'm a proponent of having SROs in schools. The schools that I went to, that I grew up in, all of them had locked exterior doors. The main egress doors were all secured. And we had SROs on site on campus.
SRO is Security Resource Officer?
Yes, school resource officer, security resource officer. We had them on campus. So ensuring that we are protecting folks in that regard is one thing, right? If a person, I have a twin brother, like I mentioned earlier, he's a teacher. He's an Army veteran. He's a teacher. My mom was an educator for 26 years, and I have a little sister who's also a teacher. So we work with kids a lot in my family. But that said, my mom and my brother specifically have expressed interest in being able to have that ability to protect and defend themselves in case they're posed with a direct threat to their lives. So maybe arming teachers who would be interested in being able to protect, to carry on site, and same thing in workplaces. I actually dealt with a disgruntled employee just earlier this year, and he was making threats to come back and harm me. And with that, like, people were like, are you going to carry your gun? They, and asking those kinds of questions. And so I would say, like, if a person, making sure that people feel like they have the right to carry, if they can, doing away with gun free zones, could be an effective solution.
Yeah. I mentioned my friends earlier, they were federal, corrections or parole officers. And one of the things they said was that at night, both of them sleep with their pieces under their pillows. They said they have to do that because they never know.
Yeah.
I believe they're very responsible people, however, but I do appreciate that they have to have that concern.
Yeah. Working in the jail, we would get a lot of like threats to, like, we're going to shoot staff on their way out of the building or on their way off campus. And in response to that, we had increased law enforcement presence in the parking lot to ensure that if someone was going to try and attack one of us, we were protected.
All I know is I have a guide dog who says, if I don't get my bones on time, you're in serious trouble.
That's right.
No, he's a wonderful lab. He's a cutie. How has your background and experience affected or helped you in formulating what you do with the youth center that you're working at now in Colorado?
I think that my background and my experience, I love working with young people. And so I don't disclose, of course, to the youth that I work with that I'm a firearms instructor at all. But I use a lot of my behavioral health experience, my experience from working in corrections, my experience in crisis de-escalation. I utilize that experience quite a bit. I was able to develop a restorative justice program for our youth at our shelter. Because we have like an accountability system, and I was able to revise that accountability system to make it a little bit more equitable by introducing this restorative justice program so that we could prevent youth striking out just due to behavior issues or whatever. And like going back onto the streets and things like that. So yeah, I've used a lot of my experience to be able to better support the young people that I work with.
You feel you're making progress, I assume.
Yeah, it's a really rewarding career.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's nothing like working with kids.
Yeah.
And even adults who are like kids, but you got to have the right adults for that. But there's nothing like working with kids. I love to teach and interact with kids. It is so much fun. But I know that there's a lot of challenges for kids today. And I know that when I was a kid, it was a whole lot different than it is now. And I wouldn't want to be a parent or a kid today with just so many uncertainties that we all face.
Absolutely.
Well, Caryn, I've got to tell you, this has been much more fun and for me, a great learning experience than I expected. And I hope and really appreciate you coming on and hope that you enjoyed it as well. And we'd like to definitely keep up with you and what you're doing. If people want to reach out and learn about what you're doing or talk with you, maybe learn about the firearms training program or other things about you, how do they do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. It's just Carynn Rudolph on LinkedIn. You can connect with
Carynn Rudolph.
Yes, and Rudolph is spelled just like the reindeer, Rudolph.
Right.
If you are interested in learning more about the firearms training that I do, you can look up Goliath Tactical Firearms Training that way. And you can find me on all social media platforms. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, building a Twitter page and all that sort of stuff, just so that folks can stay connected.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate you being on here and helping us have a better understanding of all of this. And I believe you absolutely have done that. So thank you. And for you listening out there, really appreciate you listening. Would love to hear your thoughts about this and all the things that we do. So please feel free to email me, Michael H.I. at accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com. Or if you'd like to listen to podcasts and more of them, or reach us that way, go to michaelhinkson.com and click on podcast. And then you can find us and listen to more podcast episodes and definitely give us some feedback. And wherever you're listening, please give us a 5-star rating. We really appreciate that. I know that Caryn would really appreciate you doing that, and that you'll reach out to her as well. So really, thank you very much for listening to us. And Caryn, one more time, thank you very much for being here and giving us a lot of insights today.
Thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it.